Not all at once, and not everywhere, but enough that the sound people have lived with for years simply isn't there anymore. No rolling thunder on the horizon, no distant crack of rifles, just wind, footsteps, voices that sound almost too loud in the absence of everything else. A soldier walks down a street he remembers and doesn't recognize it. Buildings still stand, but something about them feels hollow. Shop windows are dark, faces are thinner. The rhythm of life is unfamiliar, as if the place has learned how to exist without him. In the town square, there are no banners, no brass bands, no great cinematic moment of relief, just people moving cautiously, unsure whether the silence is permanent or temporary. Someone is missing. Several someones, actually. Neighbors who never came back, friends whose names are now spoken carefully, or not at all. The war has ended, but absence has not. For years, everything pointed forward. Survive the next barrage, hold the next line, make it to the next letter, the next leave, the next rumor of an ending. Now the ending has arrived, and it feels strangely unfinished. This is the moment no one prepared for. We spend a lot of time talking about how wars begin. We dissect decisions, trace alliances, analyze strategies. We even explain how wars are fought. But the aftermath, the long, uneven process of living with what happened, is harder to capture and easier to overlook, because endings are supposed to feel like conclusions. This one doesn't. This is the final episode of Echoes of the Great War, and it isn't about what happened next on the calendar. It's about what endured, what followed soldiers home, what settled into politics, memory, trauma, and everyday life long after the last shots were fired. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 15. In this episode, we step away from battlefields and treaties and into consequences. We'll explore how the human cost of the war reshaped lives that never fully returned to normal. How political systems staggered under the weight of peace. How new nations struggled to stand and old ones struggled to let go. And we'll ask the question that lingers after every war like this one. How does a conflict continue shaping the world long after it officially ends? When the war ends, the numbers arrive first. They are recited in reports, carved into stone, summarized in ledgers and speeches. Millions dead, millions more wounded. An entire generation altered in ways that are difficult to capture with statistics alone. These figures are meant to provide scale, but they rarely provide understanding, because the true cost of the war does not live only in cemeteries. It lives in bodies that no longer function as they once did, in minds that cannot return to earlier rhythms, in societies that have lost so many people that absence becomes a defining feature of everyday life. The physical damage is impossible to ignore. Industrial warfare produces injuries on a scale and of a kind that earlier generations had never encountered. Artillery shatters bodies rather than wounding them cleanly. Machine gun fire leaves little chance for survival once exposed. Chemical weapons damage lungs and eyes long after the fighting stops. Men return home missing limbs or missing faces. Some have learned to walk again on prosthetics that barely resemble legs. Others hide behind scarves, masks, or silence, their injuries too unsettling for polite conversation. Chronic pain becomes a companion. Illness lingers. For many, survival is permanent impairment. These injuries are visible. They force recognition, even when society is uncomfortable with what it sees. The psychological wounds are far easier to dismiss and far harder to heal. During the war, doctors struggle to understand what is happening to soldiers who shake uncontrollably, lose the ability to speak, collapse under noise, or stare blankly through conversations. The term shell shock enters the vocabulary, but it explains little. Is it physical damage from explosions? Is it weakness? Is it fear? Often, it is treated as a failure of character rather than an injury. Men are told to rest, to recover, to return to duty. Others are punished. Some are executed for cowardice. There is no clear framework for understanding trauma that does not leave visible marks. The war produces millions of survivors whose minds have adapted to constant danger and cannot easily adapt back. After the war, this does not improve quickly. Nightmares persist. Sudden noises trigger panic. Emotional numbness replaces connection. Many veterans struggle to articulate what they feel, not because they lack words, but because the experience itself resists language. How do you explain years spent waiting for death when the waiting itself was the most exhausting part? Survivor's guilt becomes common. Why did I come back when others did not? This question haunts men who did everything asked of them and still feel as though survival requires justification. They attend funerals long after the war has ended. They see names etched into monuments and feel relief mixed with shame. Survival, instead of being a gift, becomes a burden. Society, meanwhile, is eager to move forward. There is rebuilding to do, economies to restart, political crises to manage. The war is framed as a sacrifice already made something to be honored, not examined too closely. Veterans are praised in speeches, but expected to reintegrate quickly and quietly. There is little patience for prolonged suffering. Psychological injury does not fit neatly into this narrative. It does not resolve itself on a timetable. It does not always look heroic. And so it is often misunderstood or ignored. Men who cannot work are labeled unreliable. Those who withdraw are seen as broken. Those who lash out are feared. The war ends on paper, but in minds and bodies, it continues. Communities feel this loss collectively. Entire villages are missing their young men. Family lines end abruptly. Gender balances shift. In some places, a generation of women will never marry, not because they choose not to, but because there are not enough men to marry. Children grow up without fathers. Parents bury sons, they expected to outlive them. Mourning becomes institutionalized. Mass graves appear where individual funerals were impossible. Tombs of unknown soldiers stand in for countless missing bodies. Monuments are erected in town squares, listing names in long columns, familiar surnames repeated again and again. Rituals emerge, moments of silence, commemorative days, wreath, laying ceremonies. These acts serve an important purpose. They provide structure for grief when explanation is impossible. But they also replace understanding with symbolism. The enormity of loss becomes something to be observed rather than processed. Memory becomes formal, controlled, and distant. The war is remembered, but not always confronted. This matters because unresolved trauma does not remain static. It shapes politics. It influences culture. It hardens attitudes. Veterans bring their experiences into public life, sometimes as calls for peace, sometimes as justification for strength, order, and revenge. The same trauma can produce radically different outcomes depending on where it lands and how it is received. Trauma, in this sense, is not an individual problem. It is a social condition. Entire societies have been trained for years to accept mass death as normal, to live with uncertainty, to endure loss without explanation. When the fighting stops, those habits do not disappear. They linger in how people view authority, risk, and violence. The Great War changes what feels possible. It teaches millions that systems can collapse, that life can end suddenly and without reason, that survival often has little to do with merit or morality. These lessons do not fade easily. They shape how people respond to future crises and how willing they are to believe promises of stability. This is why the war's aftermath feels so unsettled, because trauma is not evenly distributed and it is not evenly acknowledged. Some wounds are honored, others are hidden. Some losses are named, others are absorbed quietly into daily life. But all of them contribute to a world that no longer assumes progress is inevitable or safety is guaranteed. The war ends. but its human cost does not. It lingers in bodies that ache, minds that cannot rest, and societies that struggle to understand what they have become. Trauma becomes an echo, not loud like artillery, but persistent, shaping everything that follows. And as we move forward in this episode, we'll see how these personal consequences intersect with political ones, and how a world full of wounded people becomes a world that is far harder to stabilize, because when trauma is widespread, instability is never far behind. The train slows as it approaches the station. For months, sometimes years, movement has meant something very specific. Forward positions, supply lines, rotations to the rear, evacuations under fire, trains that carried men toward danger more often than away from it. Now, this train is doing something unfamiliar. It is bringing someone home. The veteran steps down onto the platform carrying a bag that feels lighter than it should. Not because it holds little, but because so much has already been left behind. Equipment was turned in, uniforms replaced. The Army reduced a life of constant vigilance into a handful of documents and a ticket. Physically, the journey is over. Emotionally, it has barely begun. The street leading away from the station looks almost the same. Buildings are still there. The road curves where it always has. But the veteran walks it cautiously, as if expecting something to happen. Years of training have taught his body that unfamiliar quiet is dangerous. Silence is not peace. Silence is what comes before something goes wrong. People recognize him. Some smile, some nod, a few offer congratulations. Someone calls him a hero, a word that feels strange in his ears. He knows what heroism looked like at the front, and it did not resemble speeches or medals. It looked like endurance. It looked like luck. The welcome is polite and brief. There is no parade, no band, no sense that the town knows what to do with him now that he is back. During the war, his role was clear. He belonged somewhere. He was needed. Now he is simply present, and presence alone feels inadequate. Home is different too. The door opens, and faces appear that he recognizes immediately, and yet struggles to place emotionally. His parents look older. A sibling has grown into an adult in his absence. A partner, if one waited, carries years of worry and adjustment in their posture. Everyone has learned how to live without him. They are happy he survived. They are not prepared for who returned. Conversation falters quickly. Simple questions feel impossible to answer honestly. How was it? Are you all right? The veteran nods. He says he's fine. He talks about weather, about food, about the journey. He does not talk about the things that wake him at night. Because how do you explain a life built entirely around not dying? Sleep becomes difficult almost immediately. The bed is too soft. The room is too quiet. Every sound feels out of place. When he does sleep, it is shallow. Dreams collapse into memories without warning. He wakes alert, heart racing, unsure where he is for a few seconds that stretch too long. During the day, ordinary situations provoke unease. Crowds feel threatening. Sudden noises trigger instinctive reactions. He scans rooms automatically, noting exits, corners, lines of sight. His body remembers the war even when his mind wants to forget it. Work is another battlefield. Employment was never guaranteed, even before the war. Now, competition is fierce. Economies are damaged. Jobs are scarce. Employers are wary of men who seem distant, irritable, or unreliable. Some veterans are welcomed back into previous positions. Many are not. The skills learned at the front do not translate easily. Obedience, endurance, the ability to function under extreme stress. These are not things job postings ask for, and yet, without the structure of military life, days stretch endlessly. Purpose evaporates. The veteran begins to feel that survival was a temporary condition, not a foundation for a future. Relationships strain under the weight of unspoken experience. Loved ones expect gratitude, relief, joy. The veteran feels all of these things but muted, tangled with frustration and guilt. He cannot explain why happiness feels incomplete, why safety feels unreal, why boredom feels intolerable. When he tries to talk, words fail him. Descriptions feel inadequate. Details sound grotesque or trivial depending on how they are framed. He senses discomfort in the room when he speaks honestly. People want reassurance that the war is over, not reminders that it lingers. So he stops talking. This withdrawal is often misinterpreted. Family members assume distance means ingratitude. Employers assume unreliability. Neighbors assume bitterness. Few understand that the veteran is not refusing to rejoin civilian life. He simply does not know how. Peace demands skills the war did not teach. The war taught survival, not reintegration. It taught obedience, not autonomy. It taught men how to function in chaos, not how to build meaning in stability. And so many veterans exist in a limbo between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Over time, this unresolved tension seeks outlets. Some veterans retreat inward. They isolate themselves, finding comfort only among others who shared similar experiences. Veterans organizations form, offering camaraderie, recognition, and shared language. For many, these groups provide the first space where they feel understood again. Others move in a different direction. Disillusionment hardens into resentment. The gap between sacrifice and reward becomes impossible to ignore. Governments that promise purpose now appear distant or indifferent. Political movements that offer clarity, discipline, and belonging gain appeal especially those that frame suffering as betrayal rather than tragedy. The war's legacy becomes politicized through these lives. Veterans carry authority. They have endured what others have not. Their voices matter, and movements that harness that authority can shape entire societies. In some countries, veterans become advocates for peace. In others, they become symbols of grievance and national humiliation. Many simply carry on quietly. They marry. They work when they can. They raise children. But the war never fully leaves them. It surfaces in habits, in silences, in reactions that seem disproportionate to the present moment. Their families inherit fragments of it without fully understanding where those fragments came from. This is what the aftermath looks like on the ground. Not collapse, not celebration, but adjustment uneven, painful, incomplete. The veteran did not leave the war behind. The war followed him home and multiplied. Because when millions of individuals experience the same dislocation, the same inability to reconcile survival with meaning, it becomes more than a personal struggle. It becomes a societal condition. Peace is declared, but healing is not automatic. Survival does not equal resolution, and the battlefield does not disappear when the uniform comes off. It simply changes shape, moving inward into homes, workplaces, politics, and memory. This is one of the Great War's most enduring echoes. Not the sound of guns, but the quiet persistence of lives permanently altered, trying to exist in a world that expects them to be finished with a war that is not finished with them at all. When the fighting stops, governments expect relief. What they inherit instead is strain. The Great War does not simply exhaust armies. It drains legitimacy, credibility, and trust. States emerge from the conflict having demanded extraordinary sacrifice from their populations, and now they must explain what those sacrifices achieved. For many governments, that proves far more difficult than mobilizing for war in the first place. The economic aftershocks arrive quickly. War economies were built on borrowing, emergency controls, and deferred consequences. When peace comes, those consequences can no longer be postponed. Inflation accelerates as governments struggle to service debt, accumulated over years of total mobilization. Currencies weaken, prices rise faster than wages, savings evaporate. For civilians who endured rationing and deprivation during the war, the promise of peace was supposed to mean improvement. Instead, many find themselves facing unemployment, food shortages, and uncertainty. Factories close or retool slowly. Soldiers return faster than jobs appear. The transition from war production to civilian life proves uneven and painful. Debt hangs over everything. Victorious states are owed money they need but cannot easily collect. Defeated states face obligations they cannot realistically meet. International finance becomes a web of resentment and dependency, with political consequences baked into economic arrangements. Recovery becomes uneven and inequality deepens. Economic instability feeds political polarization. During the war, dissent was suppressed in the name of unity. After the war, it returns with force. Parties that once dominated politics are blamed for failure, corruption, or betrayal. Trust in traditional elites erodes rapidly. Governments that promise victory must now manage disappointment. Extremism flourishes in this environment. On the left, revolutionary movements argue that the war proved the bankruptcy of existing systems. They point to mass death, inequality, and profiteering as evidence that reform is insufficient. On the right, nationalist and authoritarian movements frame defeat or compromise as humiliation imposed by enemies within and without. Moderation struggles to survive between these poles. New democracies are especially vulnerable. Across Europe, monarchies have collapsed or weakened. Republics replace them often quickly, sometimes reluctantly. These new governments inherit populations accustomed to emergency powers, censorship, and centralized authority. Democratic norms have little time to take root before they are tested. Institutions are fragile, constitutions are young, coalitions are unstable. Governments rise and fall with alarming frequency. Elections do not necessarily produce legitimacy. Parliaments fracture along ideological lines. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than strategic. In this climate, patience is scarce. Peace requires stability, but stability requires trust, and trust is precisely what the war has eroded. Veterans play a critical role in this instability. Millions of men return home, trained in discipline, accustomed to hierarchy, and deeply disillusioned. They have experienced systems that demanded obedience and offered meaning, however brutal. Civilian life often feels incoherent by comparison. Many veterans organize. Some form advocacy groups to demand pensions, medical care, and recognition. Others join paramilitary organizations, political militias, or nationalist leagues. Uniforms are replaced by armbands. Marches replace drills. The language of the front carries into politics. Veterans command respect and fear. They possess moral authority rooted in sacrifice. They also possess experience with violence. Governments are often hesitant to confront them directly. Political movements that attract veteran support gain legitimacy quickly, even when their goals undermine democratic norms. This dynamic destabilizes public life. Political disputes increasingly feel existential. Compromise is framed as weakness. Opponents are treated not as rivals, but as enemies. The habits of war urgency, suspicion, zero-sum thinking persist long after the guns fall silent. International instability compounds these internal pressures. Borders drawn in haste create disputes that flare almost immediately. New states lack defensible boundaries. Minority populations contest their inclusion. Old rivalries reemerge in altered forms. The promise that treaties would settle questions permanently proves illusory. Treaty resentment becomes a constant undercurrent. Defeated states view the peace as unjust and temporary. Victorious states fear that any revision will undermine the settlement entirely. Enforcement requires cooperation that no one is fully willing to provide. Security becomes a matter of deterrence rather than confidence. Fear of renewed conflict never fully disappears. Armies demobilize, but not completely. Planning continues. Alliances shift quietly. Governments speak the language of peace while preparing for instability. The war has taught leaders that preparedness matters more than optimism. This creates a paradox. Peace is officially declared, but politically, The world behaves as if another crisis is always imminent. War has destroyed more than buildings and lives. It has undermined belief in the systems meant to manage conflict peacefully. Authority feels provisional. Institutions feel temporary. Laws feel negotiable. When governments struggle, citizens remember that power can collapse because they have seen it happen. Peace inherits this memory, and it lacks the tools to resolve it. The mechanisms designed to prevent future war are cautious, slow, and dependent on goodwill that is already depleted. When crises emerge, responses are hesitant. Every decision risks reopening wounds. Every compromise risks appearing weak. Instability becomes normalized. This is why the aftermath of the Great War feels unsettled, not just socially, but politically. The war did not end with decisive reconciliation or collective reckoning. It ended through exhaustion, collapse, and compromise under pressure. The political order that follows reflects those conditions. Governments are expected to deliver stability without resources, legitimacy without trust, and peace without resolution. Some manage briefly, others do not. And across all of them, the same lesson lingers quietly but persistently. War destroys legitimacy as much as infrastructure. And peace, when built on exhaustion rather than consensus, inherits instability without the means to contain it. This is not failure by accident. It is the natural consequence of a conflict that consumed everything it touched, including the political foundations needed to secure what came after. Independence often arrives wrapped in celebration. Flags are raised, borders are announced, speeches are delivered promising renewal, dignity, and self-determination. For many new nation-states born out of the collapse of empires after 1919, independence feels like the long-awaited reward for years, sometimes centuries of subordination. But beneath the ceremonies, the reality is far more fragile. A new state does not inherit stability. It inherits responsibility without preparation. Imagine a country appearing almost overnight on the map of Europe. Its capital is newly designated. Its government assembled from political movements that, until recently, defined themselves in opposition rather than administration. Its people share language, perhaps culture, but not necessarily experience, loyalty, or expectations. Optimism exists. It has to. Independence is supposed to mean control over destiny. The belief that suffering had meaning, that sacrifice was not wasted. Yet from the first days, uncertainty presses in. Borders are rarely clear. The lines drawn on post-war maps often reflect compromise rather than consensus. They follow railways, rivers, or old administrative boundaries instead of ethnic realities. Minority populations find themselves suddenly living in states they did not choose, governed by languages they do not speak, under flags they do not recognize as their own. What was once imperial diversity becomes national tension. Governments must now answer questions they have never faced before. Who belongs? Who does not? Which language is official? Which laws apply? How much autonomy is acceptable before unity dissolves? Every answer risks alienating someone. Weak economies compound the problem. Imperial systems once integrated regions into larger economic networks. When empires collapse, those networks fracture. New states inherit disrupted trade routes, limited industrial bases, and currencies without credibility. Inflation is common, investment scarce, infrastructure uneven or damaged by war. Governments need revenue to function, but taxation is politically dangerous in societies already strained by hardship. Promises made during independence movements, land reform, equality, prosperity quickly collide with fiscal reality. Disillusionment follows fast. International pressure arrives early and rarely gently. Recognition by major powers is essential for survival. Without it, a state risks isolation, economic marginalization, or outright invasion. But recognition often comes with expectations, alignments, guarantees, and obligations that limit true autonomy. Security is the most urgent concern. New states lack strong armies. Their borders are contested. Their neighbors may be hostile or simply opportunistic. Alliances offer protection, but also dependence. Neutrality feels dangerous in a world still shaped by the habits of war. Independence is fragile when survival depends on the goodwill of stronger powers. Internally, national identity is still forming. The idea of the nation may be recent, even aspirational. Citizens are asked to shift loyalty from empire to state, from regional identity to national one. This does not happen automatically. It requires education, symbols, shared narratives, and time. Time is scarce. Political factions compete to define what the nation should be. Some emphasize democracy and pluralism. Others prioritize unity, order, and strength. In societies facing economic hardship and security threats, arguments for firm control often resonate more strongly than appeals to abstract freedoms. Emergency measures become tempting. Authoritarian tendencies emerge not always from ideology, but from fear. Leaders justify concentrated power as temporary necessity. Opposition is framed as destabilizing. Dissent becomes suspect. The language of survival replaces the language of liberty. Veterans further complicate this environment. Many new states are populated by men who fought in imperial armies, nationalist militias, or irregular units. They return home with weapons, discipline, and expectations of recognition. They are politically mobilized, accustomed to hierarchy, and often skeptical of civilian authority. Some become defenders of the new state. Others become its greatest threat. Militarized politics takes root easily in societies, where legitimacy feels provisional, and force has recently proven decisive. Long-term vulnerability becomes structural. New nation-states often lack buffers against crisis. A bad harvest, a financial shock, or a border incident can escalate quickly. Institutions are young and untested. Compromise feels risky when unity seems fragile. External powers exploit this. Economic dependence deepens. Security guarantees come with strings attached. Political influence flows across borders through loans, advisors, and ideological movements. Independence exists, but autonomy remains constrained. Over time, frustration grows. Citizens compare the promise of independence with its reality. Some conclude that democracy is too slow, too weak, too divided to deliver security or prosperity. Others cling to pluralism, hoping institutions will mature if given time. History shows that time is not always granted. Many of the states born after the Great War will survive. Some will thrive, others will fracture, fall into authoritarianism, or be absorbed into larger conflicts. What unites them is not failure, but fragility. Their struggle is not evidence that independence was a mistake. It is evidence that independence is not stability. Statehood is not an outcome, it is a process. One that requires resources, legitimacy, trust, and patience, precisely the things the Great War depleted most severely. These new nation-states carry the echoes of collapse within them. Their borders, politics, and identities are shaped by a war they did not start, negotiated by powers they could not control, and concluded under conditions that offered little margin for error. They are born into a world already unstable, and they are asked to make it whole. The Great War ends, but it does not conclude. What it leaves behind is not a single lesson neatly defined and universally accepted, but a collection of warnings absorbed unevenly, interpreted selectively, and often forgotten when they become inconvenient. The first and most obvious lesson is military. World War I reveals, with brutal clarity, what happens when industrial capacity is applied to human conflict. Mass production does not simply make armies larger, it makes killing impersonal, scalable, and relentless. Artillery barrages replace maneuver. Machine guns dominate open ground. Chemical weapons blur the line between battlefield and environment. Most importantly, civilians are no longer incidental. They become targets through logistics, blockades, and air power. Starvation becomes a weapon. Cities become vulnerable. The distinction between front line and home front erodes until it nearly disappears. Military planners do take note of this, but they often draw the wrong conclusions. They focus on new technologies while underestimating the human cost those technologies impose. They seek efficiency rather than restraint. Innovation becomes synonymous with advantage, even when it accelerates destruction faster than strategy can contain it. The political lessons are more uncomfortable. The war demonstrates the limits of punishment-based peace. Treaties designed to impose responsibility without reconciliation create compliance without consent. Resentment festers where legitimacy is absent. Stability imposed externally rarely endures internally. International institutions emerge from the war with noble intentions and limited power. They depend on cooperation from states still shaped by fear, mistrust, and exhaustion. When enforcement becomes politically inconvenient, principles erode quickly. Peace requires patience. The post-war world lacks it. Governments learn that legitimacy matters, but too often only after it has been lost. Emergency powers, propaganda, and repression may mobilize societies for war, but they corrode the trust needed for peace. Once authority is exercised through coercion, restoring consent becomes extraordinarily difficult. Socially, the war leaves a deeper imprint than many leaders anticipate. Trauma does not fade on command. It embeds itself in families, communities, and national narratives. Memory becomes selective. Some experiences are commemorated, others are silenced. Heroism is celebrated. Suffering is compartmentalized. Over time, these choices shape identity. Nations remember themselves through the lens of sacrifice, victimhood, or betrayal. These memories influence politics long after the original events recede. Children inherit interpretations of the war they never experienced and act on them as if they had. Trauma, when unacknowledged, becomes transmissible. The moral lessons are perhaps the most troubling. The Great War exposes a widening gap between technological capability and ethical restraint. Weapons evolve faster than laws. Systems optimize for output, not consequence. Decisions made far from the battlefield produce suffering that feels abstract to those who authorize it and immediate to those who endure it. No single individual intends catastrophe. But systems amplify human decisions until outcomes exceed intention. Bureaucracy disperses responsibility. Chain of command obscures accountability. What begins as calculation becomes momentum. This is one of the war's most enduring warnings. Modern conflict is rarely driven by malice alone. It is driven by structures that reward escalation, punish hesitation, and normalize suffering once it becomes routine. The tragedy is not ignorance. It is selective attention. Some lessons are absorbed quickly, others are resisted. Many are remembered only after conditions have already shifted again. The interwar years will be filled with debate, reform, denial, and rationalization, often simultaneously. Warnings will be issued. They will not always be heeded. The unresolved tensions of the Great War do not disappear. They settle, they harden, they wait. Economic grievances, political resentments, and cultural wounds persist beneath the surface of apparent stability. Future wars will draw on these same structures. They will inherit the same assumptions about speed, technology, and decisiveness. They will repeat the same errors of overconfidence and underestimation. They will promise control and deliver consequence. This is not because the lessons were unavailable. It is because they were uncomfortable. The Great War teaches that modern conflict reshapes everything it touches: bodies, minds, states, and systems. It teaches that peace cannot be sustained by exhaustion alone. It teaches that technology, without ethics, magnifies harm. And it teaches that systems, once set in motion, are difficult to stop. But perhaps its most important lesson is this: understanding comes too late if it only arrives after collapse. The warnings are there. The echoes remain. Whether they are heard or ignored determines what comes next. The Great War does not end the way it began. There is no single decision that closes it, no moment that restores balance. What remains instead is a trail of consequences, some immediate, others delayed, spreading outward from the years we've spent tracing together. We followed this war from mobilization, fueled by confidence, to endurance measured in years rather than victories, to collapse that arrived not with clarity, but with exhaustion. We've seen systems strain, then fail. We've watched people adapt to catastrophe and carry it with them when the fighting stopped. What's left behind is not silence, it's resonance. Borders drawn in haste echo through later crises. Political movements shaped by loss echo through unstable democracies. Trauma carried by veterans echoes through families, communities, and national memory. Institutions designed under pressure echo their limitations when tested again. Even the language of the war endures. Ideas about total war, civilian vulnerability, decisive technology, and moral necessity will reappear, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, in the conflicts that follow. The people who lived through this war understood that something fundamental had shifted, even if they could not yet see where it would lead. That is the nature of an echo. It doesn't repeat the original sound exactly. It reshapes it, carries it forward, alters how it's heard the next time. The Great War ends in 1919, but its echoes shape the decades that follow: the politics of fear, the promises of order, the belief that systems can control violence if only they are designed correctly. And again, history will test those assumptions. This season has been about one war, but it's also been about a pattern: how human decisions made inside powerful systems create outcomes no one fully intends. How wars do not simply interrupt history, they redirect it. And how the consequences of conflict rarely stay confined to the moment they begin. That is what Echoes of War is about. Not just battles and treaties, but reverberation. Not just what happened, but what lingered. The way war reshapes the world long after the last shots are fired, and how those echoes still reach us today. The Great War is over, but its echoes are not. Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. This season was one chapter in a much longer human story. In other seasons of Echoes of War, we continue exploring other major conflicts, how they began, how they were fought, and how they reshaped the world we live in now. War is a difficult subject, and often an uncomfortable one. But understanding it matters not to glorify it and not to simplify it, but to see clearly how decisions, systems, and people shape history. If this season resonated with you, follow along for what comes next, as we continue tracing the echoes of war that still surround us.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.